I never thought my life would take such a drastic turn. When I accepted the job in Hollow Creek, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to start my career as a doctor, far from the chaos of big hospitals. The town seemed welcoming, but there was something in the atmosphere, an unsettling quietness that made me hesitate for a second. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. But I quickly realized that the residents avoided talking about the hospital, as if there was a buried secret that no one wanted to unearth. The hospital itself was old, full of long, dimly lit corridors. The smell of ether and mold permeated the air. It was as if time had stopped in that place, and I couldn't help but feel a chill as I walked through the halls. Emily, the head nurse, greeted me with a kind smile, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of worry she couldn't hide. By the third night, I began to notice strange things. At first, they were just small details, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, doors closing by themselves. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, the result of exhaustion from adjusting to a new environment. But then it happened. I was reviewing a patient's chart when I heard a whisper, almost imperceptible, calling my name. I turned abruptly, but no one was there. The corridor was deserted, the light flickering slightly. The sound seemed to come from nowhere, as if the hospital itself was watching me, waiting. That night, the impossible happened. I was on duty, taking care of an elderly patient named Mr. Thompson. He was terminal, but his words chilled me to the bone. He looked at me intently, his eyes sunken and empty, and said, "I'm already dead, doctor. And soon, you will be too." Before I could respond, the heart monitor emitted a sharp sound, and he was gone. But as I approached to check his vital signs, he opened his eyes again, looking at me with a terrified expression, as if he knew something I didn't. And then, he whispered, "Don't let them take you." He truly died that night. But his voice kept echoing in my mind. That night, I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares came. The nightmares were becoming more vivid. I saw myself running through the hospital corridors, chased by shadowy figures. And there was always that sound, a low, constant moan that seemed to come from the walls. But the most terrifying part was when I woke up in a cold sweat and heard that same sound coming from the corridor outside my room. I got up cautiously, my heart racing. I opened the door, and to my horror, I saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was Mr. Thompson, pale, his eyes bloodshot, whispering my name. I locked the door and backed away, trembling. This couldn't be real. He was dead. Emily noticed something was wrong. She insisted that I meet her after hours. Reluctantly, I agreed. We met in one of the hospital's decommissioned rooms, where she told me the truth. Decades ago, the hospital was a place of dark medical experiments. The doctors were obsessed with the idea of prolonging life after death, and for that, they conducted experiments on patients on the brink of death. But something went terribly wrong. The patients didn't die, at least not completely. Their souls remained trapped, wandering the corridors, unable to find peace. And now, those who worked at the hospital were starting to be affected. I was starting to be affected. "You didn't come here to save anyone, Doctor," Emily said, her voice low and filled with fear. "They brought you here to continue the experiments. To see if you can survive. Now, everything makes sense. I'm not the doctor who's going to save this town. I'm the next victim." The nights have become unbearable. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the cold hands of something that shouldn't exist touching me. And when I open my eyes, I see the shadowy figures around me, watching, waiting. I know I don't have much time. They want me, they want what's inside me. But I'm not going down without a fight. If someone reads this, know that Hollow Creek is a cursed place. The hospital is a prison for souls, and I am just another pawn in this macabre game. They are here. I can hear them. And I no longer know what's real. If this letter is found, know that I tried to resist. But there are forces in this place beyond understanding. If anyone dares to come here, come prepared to face the horrors that await in the shadows. I will be one of them, soon. I don't know how much time I have left. But maybe, just maybe, I can help you escape. Miguel was looking for a place to live when he found an ad that seemed perfect, a cheap room in an old house in a quiet neighborhood. Upon arrival, he was greeted by Otavio, the landlord. Otavio was a middle-aged man with restless eyes and a demeanor that shifted between cordiality and something darker. From the beginning, Miguel noticed that Otavio avoided talking about the house's basement, always steering the conversation away when the subject came up. In the first few days, Miguel realized that Otavio's behavior was stranger than he had imagined. The landlord spent hours locked in the basement, from which muffled sounds of conversations could be heard, even though there was no one else in the house. One night, Miguel clearly heard his name being called by a hoarse voice coming from beneath the floor. Intrigued and frightened, he tried to forget what had happened, but curiosity began to take over. Miguel decided to investigate the basement. One afternoon, when Otavio was out, he descended the creaking stairs. Downstairs, he found an improvised altar surrounded by extinguished candles and esoteric symbols drawn on the walls. The air was heavy, and Miguel felt a presence around him, as if he were being watched by dozens of invisible eyes. At the center of the altar was an old diary bound in worn leather. Upon opening it, Miguel read about rituals to summon entities and control lost souls. The last entry spoke of a new host that had arrived at the house. When Otavio returned, Miguel confronted him about the diary. Otavio, without losing his composure, merely smiled and said there was nothing to worry about. That night, Miguel once again woke up with the sensation of being watched. When he opened his eyes, he saw Otavio standing beside his bed, but this time, something was different. Otavio's eyes were empty, as if some other force were controlling him. In a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't have gone down to the basement." Miguel tried to flee, but he felt paralyzed, as if an invisible hand were holding him. Otavio began to murmur words in an unknown language, and Miguel saw shadows emerge from the walls, circling the bed. The shadows whispered his name, increasing the terror that gripped his body. With a desperate effort, Miguel managed to break the paralysis and ran out of the room, with the shadows chasing him through the house's corridors. As he stepped outside, the house looked different, as if it had aged decades in seconds. The windows were shattered, and the basement door was open, emitting a sickly glow. Miguel ran without looking back, feeling something trying to pull him back. When he finally got far enough away, he looked at the house one last time and saw Otavio in the basement window, his face twisted in an expression of pure hatred. Miguel never returned to retrieve his belongings. Over time, he learned that Otavio had been declared dead years ago, but the house continued to take in new tenants. None of them stayed for long, and all reported the same experiences: an unsettling presence, strange noises in the basement, and the landlord always standing by the bed, watching. The house seemed alive, feeding off the fear of those who dared to enter. Years later, Miguel was still haunted by what he had experienced. He often dreamed of the house, of Otavio, and of the shadows that nearly consumed him. He knew that the landlord was trapped in some kind of limbo, using the house as a trap to capture new souls. What Miguel didn't know was that by investigating the basement, he had become part of this cycle. And one day, he too would return to the house. Miguel now lives in constant vigilance, fearing the moment when he will hear Otavio's voice calling him again. He knows that when that happens, there will be no escape. After all, no one truly escapes the secrets the house holds.